So, Pacific School of Religion is proud to announce our spring 2023 Professors of Practice Lecture Series. This will be held over 4 consecutive Thursday evenings from February 9th to March 2nd. This semester, we are led by Nikole, a speaker, educator, author, and founder of Freely in Hope, a nonprofit which equips survivors and advocates to lead in ending sexual abuse. The Professors of Practice is a free online cross-disciplinary lecture series that brings leaders from social movements, industry, and the arts in conversation with our students and the public. Those interested are encouraged to register for one or more lectures through Eventbrite. My name is Professor Leonard McMahon, and over the course of these 4 weeks, my course, Pastoral Care for and with Marginalized Bodies, will join Ms. Lynn for lectures based around the theme, Building a Violence-Free World, Caring for Survivors of Sexual Violence in Our Communities. After each lecture, PSR Dean Susan Abraham and I, who's to my left, will enter into conversation with Ms. Lim, introducing questions from participants. Each lecture will center a theme, but will also incorporate stories of Ms. Lim's work, visual poems by survivors, and contemplative practices to ground body, mind, and soul in the difficulty of this topic. In week 1's lecture, Witnessing Dignity, which is available online, Ms. Lim discussed the practice of identifying with unfamiliar and uncomfortable stories. She outlined the pervasiveness of sexual violence from both local and global perspectives, and helped us unlearn our biases in an effort to honor all bodies in their diversity and shared humanity. Expanding upon Lecture 1, this evening, Ms. Lim will explain the harm caused by the cultural silence surrounding and perpetuating sexual violence. She will explore how holistic care can support trauma healing in survivors, while also demonstrating the impact vicarious trauma can have on those who offer such healing. Finally, she will share what it was like to start her advocacy nonprofit, Freely in Hope, teach us how to design a holistic healing program, and illustrate how she heals from secondary post-traumatic stress disorder through reciprocal healing in community. Hence, this evening's lecture is aptly titled, Healing Suffering. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Nikole Lynn via a kind hand gesture or positive reaction on Zoom. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to show you the screen. Give me 1 moment. Oh. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's so good to be back with you all as we continue in this trajectory of advocating with survivors. Last week, we talked about the practice of identifying with stories that are not our own. And this practice might bring us to places, relationships, and perspectives that are counter to our own experiences, particularly when we encounter suffering caused by violence or systems that we have not been affected by. So some of the practices that I shared were, 1, to get closer, and that's in terms of physical proximity, relational proximity, leaning in to stories that are not our own. 2nd is to honor the diversity of all humans in a non-judgmental stance, undoing biases that we might have against each other, keeping our hearts open to the possibility of learning something new. 3rdly, we discussed how we can share commonalities, identifying with each other's pains and joys in our common humanity. And I wanted to add a 4th element, kind of based on the feedback that I got from our professors here. The 4th element that I wanted to add in response to what are the emotional mechanics to approaching diverse stories and diverse worlds. And I wanted to add practicing presence. I brought this question to my staff in our staff meeting last week, which are half Zambian, half Kenyans. And it was interesting to discuss this question with them because they were like, being in community with each other, practicing presence with each other, showing up consistently with each other, leading authentically, loving unconditionally, sharing meals, celebrating each other's diverse culture. All of that requires time, intentionality, and presence. And there's no answer to those things, but rather they are practices, which is why, again, I wanted to emphasize that these are practices that can be evolved based on where we are in what season and what time. As we all have a role to play in this world, we are a part of a global community. Our words, our actions, and our beliefs may intentionally or unintentionally bring harm to someone else. At the same time, inaction or silence can also perpetuate further harm, directly or indirectly. As leaders of faith, we're a part of this larger ecosystem of our world. I think we have the power to shape our world in a way that brings about the peace of God, instead of perpetuating the same violence that our ancestors caused or our ancestors endured. So today's topic is on healing suffering. Too often, survivors of sexual violence have been told to remain silent to protect the perpetrator. Their stories aren't believed, validated, or taken seriously. In addition to the incident of violence, survivors experience even more shame and trauma from leaders of faith, often because of, instead of being a place of safety, we have become a place of hostility. Instead of listening with empathy, we question the truth. Instead of calling out abuse, we remain silent. And I think we've seen many cases arise in recent years of religious leaders, faith leaders that we have admired for. And perhaps we choose silence because we do not want to bring shame to the community by exposing the perpetrator. Perhaps we choose silence because we are afraid of the relationships we might lose as a result of speaking the truth. Perhaps we choose silence because we are afraid of our responsibility to change a very violent system that has benefited only some, but not others. In today's topic, I want to explore the harm of cultural silencing that perpetuates sexual violence and the ways that we can respond as leaders in our global community. So to begin, as we engage in these deeper practices of identifying the stories of those who've experienced suffering, we will be listening to the direct voices of survivors. And when these stories become difficult to hear, do what feels necessary for you in your body. Cry, move, take a break, breathe. And so to start, I want to invite us to begin our class today with 3 grounding breaths together. And inhaling through the nose. And exhaling deeply. Inhaling through the nose. And exhaling deeply, expelling all of the stale, stagnant air that has accumulated throughout the day. And lastly, inhaling through the nose to receive the newness of what we have in store during this course. And exhaling deeply. I want to remind you that your breath is always available. It's a reminder that divine breath lives and moves and breathes through us. We can access this breath at any time. So today's opening practice will be the practice of breath as prayer. Following the rhythm of our breath, we will silently inhale a phrase and exhale a phrase. And today I wanted to share this prayer from Cole Arthur Riley, Prayer in Black Liturgies, after which we will breathe together, again, 3 grounding breaths to commune in the same spirit across time zones. And on the inhale, silently breathing to yourself, I am not alone. And on the exhale, we will bear it together. And I will read this prayer first. God of belonging, we are grateful that you modeled for us a divine community within yourself. Many of us long for connection and interdependence, but we have become used to enduring the sounds of our own loneliness. We confess that we've been so acquainted with loss and abandonment that we struggle to believe there are those who truly want to be with us. Keep us from pushing them away. Form us to be people of collective responsibility, that we would never become too familiar with hyper-independence, but would find ourselves participating in communal restoration and care. Let us find that community which can both hold our lament and rouse our laughter, those who can name their needs and allow space for others. Let us belong to one another in true mutuality, knowing our burdens and hopes and liberation are mysteriously entwined. Let us bear it together. We won't be free alone. And on the inhale, I am not alone. And on the exhale, we will bear it together. And I'll allow you to do 2 more in your own rhythm of your own breath. Let the prayer through our breath be a reminder that our suffering should not lead us to isolation, but to sharing of each other's burdens that moves us forward. Amen.
Amen.
Last week, I shared the story of Nikole and how her story challenged me to confront the realities of sexual violence in her community in Kenya. And I saw myself in her, reminded of the commonalities that we shared in terms of our age, our dreams, our future hopes for our children, while also holding the tension of my privilege and power and authority as a filmmaker in that space. And so I sent her money for her school fees, which was the easiest thing I could do. And when she rose to the top of her class that semester, I felt God asking me, what are you going to do about it? And I responded to tell God, well, I'm telling her story through film. And that was what I was supposed to do. And that was all I would do. But the reality was that I was afraid to engage deeper into the suffering of the world, afraid that I would be confronted with my own suffering. And so I distanced myself and tried to mute the stories that were waiting for someone to simply listen, someone to understand, someone to act, someone to believe in the possibility of hope. But disengaging from suffering only perpetuated the same culture of silencing that I was also trapped in. In being so used to silencing my own suffering, I was also prone to silencing others. So you remember her, homegirl on the left? That's me if you forgot. Growing up, I was taught that we are not to talk about those things, about sex and sexual violence and the beauty of our bodies. So I tried to cover it up with oversized hoodies and cargo pants. The media constantly portrays women as objects to be commodified, seen but not heard, beautiful but only in ways that meet the approval of men. We have been conditioned to believe that we have no autonomy or voice. Tired of being shamed or blamed for crimes we did not commit, many of us succumb to the oppression as it may be the only way to survive in this violent world. But cultural silencing causes great harm to us all. In my preteen years, where I was in this picture, I had to silence myself because I had this strong anger and rage within me that I was not allowed to express. I grew up in a wonderful, loving family, never been abused, but I have always felt this weight of external oppression due to expectations surrounding me that I knew I could never attain. And so I suppressed this sense of anger through silence until when I was 14 years old, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And that was my first encounter with suffering. The all-consuming question of how could a loving God cause suffering like this, especially with my mother who has served God all of her life in the church? How could bad things happen to good people? God, where are you in our misery and our suffering at this news? And I heard from God through a very silent whisper, because I first loved you, learn to love yourself as you love others. Because I first loved you, learn to love yourself as you love others. And so after my mom recovered, I embarked on this journey to learn to love in context of communities that have been pushed to the margins. And that's what actually brought me to my work with international filmmaking. But that was my easy outlet. Filmmaking became that form of expression to delve into another world of stories and cultures while negating my own. Until I met Ubanga. I was in Zambia shooting a wedding for my friend when I met Mubanga, who was the niece of the groom of this wedding that I was photographing. And she really stuck out to me because she super sassy. She was 14 years old. She had this sassiness and also this kind of silent rage and suppression that I knew there was this story that was trying to emerge based on what I've experienced when I was also 14. And so I wanted to be her friend, but she was always just kind of keeping me at a distance, not knowing what to do with this Chinese person that she just met at this wedding. And there was one night where we were on our way home, walking home from a neighbor's house where we had just finished dinner, and she pulled me aside and she said, "My stomach really hurts." I said, "Well, was it something you ate? Like what? Like maybe the food was not good." And she said, "No, my stomach's been hurting over the past year." And I was like, "Oh, okay." But I could tell that there was more that needed to be said. And so I waited. And she said, it hurts all the time, but I don't want to tell anyone about it." And I was like, "Well, have you gotten to the doctor? Have you gotten it checked? Like maybe if this is a more serious issue, you should go to the doctor." She said, "No, I don't want to go to the doctor because I don't want to tell anyone what happened." So again, the presence waiting patiently if she wanted to open up, and she decided to open up, and she said, "Well, I'll tell you, but if I tell you, I want you to listen. I want you to understand." Last year, when she was 13 years old, she was walking from home to school, the route that she took every day. But one particular day, she was walking to school, and on an isolated road, several men approached her and they all had knives. They threatened to kill her if she didn't go follow them. And so, fearing for her life, she followed them into a nearby bush where they raped her in turn. And finally, she saw their weapons and she was able to pick up one of their weapons and run away. But after that incident, she was so ashamed and so fearful and unable to share with anyone because of the cultural stigmas of where were you? What were you wearing? What did you do to seduce these men? And so the pain became so great that she wanted to take her life because she could not share this shame with anyone else. And so she found a knife in the kitchen and cut her wrist. But interestingly, when she cut her wrist, she saw her blood dripping, and she realized that in her blood was also the blood of Jesus that can save her and partner with her in this journey toward healing. And she said, "Because I love you, love yourself." And that for me was just so fascinating to hear this perspective that she had. And so after she told me the story, the weight of the trauma that she had endured was almost too much for me to bear. This was probably the first time that I had heard a story of sexual violence of someone that young, and also of someone whom I identified with in that way. Someone whom I had grown a relationship with and who had felt very close to me. And I remember when I heard that story, I went and I was showering and I just broke down into tears asking God, "Where are you? You who are all loving, all compassionate, all merciful, all gracious, where are you in our suffering? Where is your advocacy for little girls who are relentlessly abused? Where is your protection that you promised for your children? God, where are you?" But I felt that God was turning those questions onto me, asking me, where is your love for my children? Where is your compassion for the innocent? Where is your mercy for the poor? Where is your grace for the exploited? Where is your advocacy for the oppressed? Where are you? Where are we when confronted with suffering? Do we hide? Do we pretend it doesn't exist? Do we avoid eye contact? Do we try to fix it as quickly as possible, giving up in despair if change doesn't happen overnight? As we witness the suffering of our world, we are confronted with our privilege, our complacency, our ignorance, our ineffectiveness, our paralysis, and our guilt. And at the same time, the suffering of our world invites us to see our role in dismantling systems of violence and fighting for the freedoms of people who have been pushed to the margins. When confronted with suffering, we can choose to deafen our ears with ignorance or to listen with compassion. And remember, compassion means to suffer with, to embark on a journey together, sharing resources in a way that brings healing. We see this constantly in the example of Jesus, where he was confronted with the suffering humanity. When religious leaders turned away, Jesus turned toward. When disciples were complacent in disbelief, Jesus made a way out of no way. When the woman with the issue of blood confronted him, he allowed her to be close, and he got closer and said, "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." To heal suffering requires that we protect the voices of survivors rather than demeaning it. To heal suffering requires that we convict the perpetrator so that further harm isn't caused. To heal suffering requires that our sanctuaries be places of safety for women, children, and all people who have been marginalized. When faced with such suffering, we have the option to respond. Responding to suffering. And so, compelled by Mubanga's story to do something more than just pay school fees, I was caught at the crossroads. In my work as a documentary filmmaker, I was going in and out of villages, in and out of homes, in and out of lives. My constant movement required no response. I was simply hired to go in to capture the story without any sense of responsibility to the stories that I captured. And as I did this throughout many mission trips and hired projects, I realized that it was insufficient. I did not have to engage in the suffering long term. I did not have to sit in the agonizing pain until justice was realized. I did not have to commit to developing relationships with people who were unlike me. After all my shoots were done, I was free to go back home to live a life of safety. But after meeting Nikole in Kenya and Mubanga in Zambia, I was reminded of the image my grandfather sent me of that little girl. When he titled the photo, "She reminds me of you." I realized that these stories that I captured all over the world, that these stories could have easily been mine. My response was to start a nonprofit in partnership with Nikole and Mubanga and with other survivors whose audacious vision was to end the cycle of sexual violence. So meeting more girls in their communities, I noticed that lack of access to safe education made girls more vulnerable to sexual violence. The girls unanimously told me that education was their highest priority, to not only liberate themselves, but to liberate their families and to liberate their communities out of poverty. I was so amazed that across all of the stories, the desire for education always was for something beyond themselves. But as they went to school, I quickly learned that solely funding school fees for children who have been through trauma was also insufficient. There was no money for transportation, so some would walk for miles, often missing their classes. There was no food at home, so some would end up back on the streets working in prostitution so that they could feed their families. There was no support for them to study, as some lived in close proximity to their abusers, who were often uncles, stepfathers, cousins, neighbors. And as these incidents arose, our services started to expand to fund safe housing, transportation, meals, healthcare, and counseling. It seemed as if there was an unending need in this cycle of perpetual abuse. Last week in our passage, we looked at Jesus' first public proclamation, quoted from Isaiah 61. I think he quoted the scripture to not only state his purpose, but I think he was also speaking the intent for all believers to follow in this trajectory of healing ministry. And I'll read it again. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And today we'll focus on the next part, which says to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion. People of faith, churches, pastors are really good at providing comfort through prayer, encouragement, pastoral counsel, community of belonging. International organizations and agencies are really good at provision, mass donations of food or shelter or resources. And in my case, the provision that we provided was in funding scholarships. But what happens when comfort and provision isn't sufficient? It isn't enough to heal such deep-seated trauma. When you get closer to suffering, when you lean in, when you build relationships through a practice of presence, you begin to understand the complexities of abuse, of trauma, and of culture. I want to share this next video, which is a visual poem that was written by Mubanga. And in this video, she is retelling the effects of trauma after being raped at 13, which is the story that she first told me. And again, as this might be difficult to watch or to listen to what your body needs, but also listen to the voice of Mubanga. Sorry, let me try it. Excuse me, let me try one more time so that everyone can hear. Make sure I click that little button. Okay, let me know in the chat.
Take it off. The skin, so dirty that soap can't wash it out. How many times do I have to take a bath? Or at least remove the heavy load off my shoulders, because walking around with it is a burden I can no longer bear. My skin doesn't not only feel dirty, but feels like a cage strangling my breath. I would love to say that I'm a shell of myself, but that I am not. I am carrying his hands, filthy, arrogant hands. I can feel every part of it on my body. As he took hold of me like a new toy he was intrigued with, wanted to explore, and as soon as he was done, I was broken and useless to him. I feel like I'm constantly choking from the thought of what you did. Afraid to close my eyes because I would see you exerting your power on me. See you stripping me off my humanity for pleasure. The worst thing is, the only way I feel it will get better is if I go. And by go, I mean die. Do I want to die by your hands? No. Would it have been easier? Yes. But living with these thoughts makes me fear for my life. What if I will go at my own hands? I did everything right. I closed my legs. I covered up. I shut my mouth. I knelt down when I was caught. I looked down when spoken to. What did I miss? I made him fall into sin. How could I have been so stupid? I met Auntie Elena on my way to the market the other day, and she said I am growing up into such a beautiful girl. That is it. It is my beautiful face, my ever-changing body that made him touch me. Now shutting my mouth up is not out of respect, because my voice has the power to destroy you. I see who you really are. You made me believe this was my fault, that I deserved it, and my body was for the taking. I know that's not true. I am not sure what womanhood looks like yet, but I am ready to take on this journey and discover it.
Throughout Kenya and Zambia, I was hearing story after story, trauma upon trauma, that had affected the girls that I loved most. Drug rapes and gang rapes, witchcraft and substance abuse, unplanned pregnancies, unwanted abortions, attempted suicides. The trauma of survivors became my own. I started experiencing nightmares, anxiety, depression, and debilitating shame. 3 years into this work, the issues surrounding my global community were so massive that secondary post-traumatic stress disorder escalated into physical illness. I believe that the violence surrounding my community were reflections of my failed leadership. I got too close and I was burned. I was falling apart. Burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary PTSD, nervous breakdowns, collapse, depression, anxiety, saviorisms. I was experiencing it all, although I didn't have the language or resources to know how to hold the weight of it at the time. The accumulation of 3 years filled with stories of unspeakable violence left me in Zambia, hospitalized with some dreadful unnamed virus. It fractured my spirit more so than my body. My body rejected everything, including water, but my spirit rejected my sense of worth. My head was consumed with relentless pain, but my mind was tortured with thoughts of inadequacy. I lost 15 pounds and I thought that I lost my calling in the process. I was in desperate need of healing, not just from physical pain, but from internal wounds of self-affliction. As I was feeling the weight of oppression surrounding me, I had also oppressed myself, believing that if I couldn't achieve this mission of protecting survivors, preventing sexual abuse, and dismantling systems of injustice, then what was even my purpose in this world? This near-death encounter forced me to recognize 3 illusions that contributed to my burnout. If you've heard of Henry Nouwen's 3 lies, where we place our identity in these lies instead of our inherent belovedness of God, these lies are also parallel to the temptations that Christ resisted. We often live into these lies, which reinforces our ego, our false self, or the mask of ourselves, instead of living into the value that we have simply by being created in the image of God. These lies are, I am what I have, I am what I do, I am what others say of me. In my own life, I've seen these lies manifest in my actions or reactions through control, ego, and shame. For I am what I have, control. As I said last week, I'm a Chinese American woman. I'm a firstborn daughter, Enneagram 8, INTJ. Control is the way that I make sense of my purpose in this world. And I thought that if only I can control all outcomes in a way that protected the people that I love, then I would be of value. If I could only fix these broken systems and bring an end to the gross injustice that I witnessed in this world, only then would I be of worth. As I tried to control all outcomes, I worked and overfunctioned to the point of illness. I was at the end of myself with nothing left to control. And I realized that just as I could not control outcomes, I could also not control the healing of my own body. But through rest and time, my body was able to heal itself beyond my control. And secondly, ego. I am what I do, the lie of I am what I do. My ego wanted to do it all on my own. I didn't want to receive help, let alone admit that I desperately needed to help. In fact, it took many people to force me to go to the hospital when I was that sick. I pushed back the signs of burnout my body was trying to warn me about. I forged ahead to create my own pathway without being present to the suffering of others. I failed to admit that the pain of the survivor is their own pain. It is their journey. It is their body that must heal in their own way. My ego was reacting according to my own solutions instead of being responsive to the needs of survivors. Surrendering my ego allowed me to open up to a survivor-centered solution that would be even greater than I could imagine. And finally, shame, the lie of I am what others say about me. To not be able to do what I had set out to do, to protect my community and pursue this audacious vision of ending sexual violence, it brought me great shame. Being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder was a blow to my ego, and it also resulted in great shame. In my culture, we also don't talk about those things, our trauma, our suffering, our deepest fears, our failures, and that brought great shame. I thought of my family who had been so supportive of my unexpected career change. I thought of the donors that had invested so much in me and the girls. And more importantly, I thought of the survivors whose dreams and visions were so powerful. I wanted so desperately to support those dreams, but I felt like I wasn't enough. My leadership, my capacity, my abilities were not enough. The shame around my illness and being diagnosed with PTSD put me on the brink of vocational suicide. I was considering giving up this calling, believing that I wasn't strong enough to hold it all. Although my secondary trauma looks much different than that of my community, I had to embark on my own healing journey if I were to be of any support to those that I loved. When I sifted through those areas of control, ego, and shame, I was again at the crossroads. I had to decide if I would attempt to continue in this work that I love so much, yet felt that I wasn't good enough for. And in my suffering and despair, I was reminded of the courage of survivors. If they could choose to get up, go to school, despite the ways that culture tried to oppress them, then perhaps I could try. If they could choose to face their perpetrator in court year after year to fight for their justice and work toward passing laws that protect the rights of other children, perhaps I could try. If they could choose to share their stories and bring hope and healing to other little girls around them, perhaps I could try. Dismantling control, ego, and shame, I had to realize that the solutions would not come through my own doing, but through the stories of survivors. How then do we heal from the effects of suffering? When I was in the hospital getting tested for whatever virus that I had, there was a moment in the waiting room where all of my senses started to heighten. I was hearing strange voices in my head calling me all sorts of names. The fluorescent lights were pulsating in my brain and making me have a headache. My body temperature rose and I started to shake. And this became the first of many anxiety attacks. So to free myself, I ran outside. I sat on the curb on this busy street in front of the hospital with my head buried into my hands. People were passing me by on this main street. Mavanga was with me at the hospital, so she ran after me. And she sat with me a while as I was trying to hold it together when I was clearly falling apart. So she sat with me. She's like, "What's wrong? Are you frustrated?" I nodded. She said, "Why?" And I said, "I'm frustrated because I can't do anything for myself in the control." She looked at me and she was like, "But you would do the same for any of us. You helped me with all the drama that I put you through." And I said, "But it's me." And that took everything within me to say this truth. And I just fell apart even more. And she told me, you deserve to be taken care of too. You're still the same strong mom that I know. Healing happens in reciprocity. Leaning into my own suffering was probably one of the hardest things I had to confront at that time in my mid-20s. Because I was so used to identifying with the stories of others. In fact, it took me 3 years before I could tell this story publicly. At Freely in Hope, we believe that telling our stories is the first step to healing. We believe that when survivors tell their stories in public, they are able to remove the shame of silence, the chokehold of the oppressor, by reclaiming their story for themselves and sharing it from their own perspective. And having wrestled through my own sense of suffering, I finally understood what that meant. Healing for the pastor, caregiver, the leader, the advocate will look different than healing for the survivor, but healing can happen in context of community as we learn from each other, as you move toward a common vision. The comfort and care that God bestows on the marginalized is also available for us as advocates, as leaders, and as pastors. And when we learn to receive those blessings, we can experience reciprocal healing. For our collective healing to take place, we must recognize our connectedness to each other. And this is what it means to love God, to love self, and to love others. To be free in as much as our global community is free. Lila Watson, activist, academic, and artist, said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. When we see ourselves in the other, our perspective begins to shift from egocentric, individualistic, self-preservation to more collective, holistic, and communal healing. To close, I wanted to read us the Beatitudes, the blessings. And I'll be reading from the Message version, which is a little bit more unique, but also very relevant to this topic of healing suffering. So let's close today with a final breath together. Inhaling through the nose. And exhaling. I'll actually do 3 breaths together again. Inhaling through the nose. And exhaling, and in your exhale, can you just shake it out? Go ahead and do so. And last breath together, inhaling through the nose. And exhaling fully. From Matthew 5. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and God's rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God, God's food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you'll find yourselves cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Wow, okay. Thank you, Ms. Lim, very much for offering us that and offering yourself and your work for us yet again this week. so much. Allow me to take just a couple minutes to respond with some series of questions, and hopefully get a chance to hear your response as well, and then we'll look towards students and their questions. So if you have any questions, if students have any questions, or anyone really, please put them in the chat, and Dean Abraham will vet those and look through those and present by those after this moment. Yes, so we'll start with, I want to start at the end and work backwards a little bit. So the chapter, that's Matthew 5, correct? Okay, so Rob Hill has a question in Matthew 5. And so my first question though is Matthew 5, when you're reading it, I was struck by the fact that that text could be read liberatively or oppressively. I don't know if you heard it. I mean, various verses, depends on which verses emphasize caring for others, and what is less of you, there's more of God, and there's this idea of shrinking oneself, and the sort of humility, as a value, as a virtue. I can see where somebody could say, you shouldn't complain or worry about yourself so much, because that means it's some kind of holy deprivation that's going to be good for you in the end. So I imagine just biblical. So my question is, in terms of biblical interpretation, how do you work with your partners? I guess I'll call them your partners in terms of biblical interpretation. Related to that is, what are the spiritual resources that are indigenous to these environments you're working in? And I'm picking up, of course, that you're working in the Christian idiom. And yet, and even in the video, I heard her reference something along those lines. But are there other resources? Are there other native spiritualities that are going on that could be accessed, used, or not? You mentioned witchcraft at one point. Just wondering. I take you at your word, but I'm wondering, well, how do you make that distinction? And so, let's see. Yeah, the storytelling. Very fascinated with the storytelling, and I'll stop with this question and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah.
But the storytelling. How are those stories constructed for public consumption? So one of the things that we do here at PSR, and I do particularly in the course that I teach my worker students, is to emphasize the idea of self-writing or journaling. Right? This is a classical. This goes all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. Not that we want to celebrate the Greeks and Romans necessarily, it goes back before them too. But how do you construct itself for public consumption? Journaling is not, I'm just speaking to them as well, the stock and all the raw data. How do you take that raw data and shape it into a public story, a narrative that does what you're hoping you want it to do? And related to that, I see a lot of the pathology there, of course, and the deep pain and the hurt and anxiety. Is there anything else? Is there anything political involved in that? Or is there anything, any anger present in these speeches? Not anger at the perpetrators, not anger at just them, but anger at other systems. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll stop at that.
Yeah, okay, I'll go to the biblical interpretations and indigenous practices first. So, biblical interpretation. So typically, I grew up with this scripture, I think we're in the 90s, yeah. And I think growing up with this, it's like you just hear it all the time. Right. But when I read the Message version, and especially in context of, I think, for myself as an advocate, that's where I've been learning, how do I not have that false sense of humility that is even more oppressive, right? So how can I be liberated from my own sense of self-oppression, like I talked about, while also liberating oppression with others in context and in tandem with others. So I think the Message version for me really stuck out for me because as an advocate, I'm learning that balance of what humility looks like, but also what advocacy looks like. Because if I were to be the humble, probably Asian woman that I had grown up believing that I was to be, this work would have not come to me. And however, because it's come to me, I've had to practice the letting go of the ego and the saviors, and that naturally align with that. And so there's this balance of recognizing your power as power with and not power over. And that was what my burnout experience was, is feeling like I had this sense of power to actually dictate the violence of humanity. Clearly, as a human, I don't. And so undoing those is where then God in healing through survivors, I think, pushes forward a more liberatory narrative. Oh, okay, I'll speak this way. And then the biblical interpretation. So indigenous practices. So my countries that I work in, Kenya and Zambia, have been colonized.
Oh.
So a lot of those indigenous practices have been demonized. So right now, actually, I've been asking them more, like, what are practices that you feel are in alignment with your Christian faith that maybe your grandmother's practice that you can find a sense of alignment. And so we're actually in this exploratory phase right now. I feel that Wangari Maathai's work, who was a huge activist, the Greenpeace movement, Kenyan women, her theology and practice kind of blends together indigenous practice of caring and cultivating the earth, advocating for the earth, advocating for women in poverty who till the earth, right? All of that together with a beautiful theology in response to the witchcraft. So that's language that our girls would use. And the incident that I have heard of and observed would be in actually like violent ways, using knives and drawing blood. So that's kind of how they would describe it to me. So I didn't go into it, and actually I do go into it in my book. There's an incident where one of the girls has like small cuts all over her body as a way of, I guess, releasing the blood, releasing the bad spirits. How I've seen that is, and this happens in Christian groups too, kind of dispelling the exorcism, right? Dispelling the demon through the blood. So that was a very harmful practice that the girls have told me before. Storytelling. So this is another workshop and lecture series, so feel free to actually hire my survivors for that. Yeah, we have a whole theory and process around storytelling, and actually those videos that I'm showing in class are from a curriculum that we've developed to help survivors tell their stories in a way that is dignifying for them. It's called the Butterfly Effect curriculum, and I'll link it for all of you to see it after the course. I'll provide a lot of resources for you to access. But we use that framework, kind of similar to the framework that I'm providing for all of you in terms of the metamorphosis story. So that's kind of how we walk through the journey of storytelling with survivors. In regards to the public consumption piece, that's a really great question. And that will definitely be determined by the storyteller. I think I see myself more as the bridge. Like if the survivor wants to tell their story, I will be the bridge to figure out what platform is best. Do you want to do a series on social media? Do you want to do an Instagram Live? Do you want to go into the community next week and speak to children or to other women in prostitution or whatever it may be? Every survivor will have their own way of reclaiming the art of storytelling in a way that is liberatory and healing for them. And I think our role is to kind of work with them to discern and determine what that might mean, how and when. And I think that's the other thing that I've learned being a filmmaker is oftentimes I'd be hired to go into the community and put the camera in front of someone's face and they have to tell me the story. And they're expected to tell the story. And it works sometimes, but I think when it comes to sexual trauma, there's more layers that needs to be unpacked, especially that sense of safety needs to be established first. And that approach may not always work. And there are also several iterations that will happen in the process of telling the story that will feel safe for the survivor, depending on each context. And so there's no really real answer to that question. But what we want to definitely promote in our organization is that the power belongs to the survivor telling the story in terms of how they want it told and all of that.
Okay. No, fantastic. Thank you. a little bit more. So in the political content, the political critique, of course, I do political theology here.
Mhm.
And so it's not, I'm interested in how broadly does the analysis go for these, your partners? How broadly do they analyze the situation, think about it, critique it? Of course, there's victim perpetrator, there's that immediate moment, things with the lot. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, so, yeah, victim perpetrator, that would be the direct violence.
Right.
Then there's communal,
Yeah.
family, what were you wearing? What were you doing out at night? What did you do to make him do that to you? And then in community, there's also religious institutions, again, because we're a colonized country. And both countries have very high percentage of Christian belief. In their churches, we've heard of many stories where girls are shunned because they were raped, or because they were working in prostitution, or because they were actually abused by the church leader. And so to cover up, they would shun the survivor. And so with all of that understanding, right, like they've experienced that many forms of violence, not just from that. And many of them would say the pain is actually more so from the family system or the church system than the perpetrator themselves, because they expect you as their family, or they expect you as their church leader, believe them, to support them, and to walk alongside of them in this journey toward compassion. And then we go to the larger systemic issue. Some of them have gone to court, and we work with International Justice Mission and other local partners on the legal end to like enter into that world. And that is one of our girls, actually. She had been fighting her case for 12 years and just won it last year.
Amen.
Amen. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's what I mean, a long-term struggle and fight that these girls are just so powerful to actually choose to be in that courtroom for 12 years, looking at the perpetrator in the eye, because they know it's not about them. It's about the larger system that they're trying to uncover. Another one of my girls, and I write about this in the book too, she was abused by a stepfather. She had been fighting her case for 6 years, lost her case. So her question was, what does justice look like for me if I lost my case, right? And that became the question. What does justice look like if you did not receive legal justice, right? Can justice look like something else? And for her, storytelling is that justice.
Yes.
Because now she's able to, and she has more confidence to share her story on public platforms at schools, churches, with children that we work with. She's also on our social media platforms, very vocal. She's on these public platforms because in telling her story, in sharing how she has been healing as a survivor, she knows that that information is going to help someone else, and that is her justice, right? And so that's how we want to infiltrate systems. We want to move into policy building as well, but for now, I think the stories and raising up these leaders, right, who could build into the systems, right? Because the reason why we fund university education, which not many organizations in Africa do, they all do primary education, but I don't know if y'all know, but primary education is free. So what are you paying for? You're paying for uniforms and final exam fees and school supplies, really. But the tuition fees are free. So when you get to high school and university, tuition fees are not free. So that's where we're trying to level out access. So the reason why we fund university education is because these are the girls that are going to be the next generation of doctors, lawyers, counselors, social workers, you name it. HR practitioners as well. We have a lot of that because they want to end sexual harassment in the workplace, right? So once we raise up girls who have experienced such trauma into these levels of leadership and authority, that's where we hope to see more systematic change coming down from their leadership.
Just a quick follow-up with that. Have the students gone to that level? Have they received professional degrees? Or we have folks who are already?
We got lawyers, we got 2 lawyers.
Okay.
We have one psychologist. We have 2 social workers. We have 1 in communication studies. We have 2 HR practitioners. and two community development leaders.
Amazing.
How about government? Anybody should,
Yeah, not yet. No one has gotten into politics
not
yet.
yet, I like that, not yet. Rumor them though.
It's up to them.
Well, they're gonna change the system, they're gonna change.
Yeah, but we have the one lawyer.
So, yeah, we're one lawyer. No, and I
One
love
lawyer.
that. Yeah, politics is definitely.
Sorry, two lawyers.
For that, and along with it, inside and outside the system. Let me ask you just a quick question. I think last week we talked a little bit about Adichie. I think we had a video with her, a single story. The other part of that video with her is she talks about the danger of the single story of Africa.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if the storytelling that is, working with the way it's being done creates a single story of Africa as suffering and pathological and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
And some of that may not be helpful. Let me let you answer that.
Yeah, into my storytelling practices?
No, theirs. I mean, in terms of how you're doing the work, it doesn't create a single story, a single narrative of Africa.
Yeah, and again, every survivor story will be different. Every journey toward healing will be different. Every way that they choose to tell their story will be different. Some of them are poets, some of them are dancers, some of them are singers, some of them are preachers, some of them are love writing, right? So and that's where, with all of them kind of choosing their pathway of story, I think that's where there's multiple stories and multiple ways that we can care for survivors as well. Because, like I said, every journey to healing will look different. So even though we do have a pathway and a formula, we know, our staff know, that that's not like the rules. We have a pathway. But for every child that comes into our program, the pathway might maneuver, it might change. We might have to provide additional resources and services for them because every story is different.
Okay. Last question. I'm going to turn to the students very shortly. Wonderful spiritual practices that you share with us. I am wondering, that you use the word silencing, the verb as a noun, a gerund. Does contemplation, those contemplative practices, does contemplation equal silence? Or does silence equal contemplation? I'm wondering about the definition of contemplation for you and for them as well.
Yeah, kind of thought you would ask that. So they're different concepts completely. When I'm talking about cultural silencing in this particular lecture, it's definitely around the systemic cultural silencing that doesn't allow women to speak. Obviously, in spiritual practice and contemplation, the gift of silence is being with self, right? And healing with self. And I think that's where I wanted to end, to say that healing happens in reciprocity, where there is absolutely individual healing that happens in solitude and silence and stillness. And in tandem, there is a collective healing that happens, and that where that reciprocity can come together. Silence is also very difficult as a contemplative practice, I will say, for a lot of our community members, and even for myself when I first started. I actually first started more contemplative practices because, and I write this in my book, when I was sick, I could not pray. I literally could not pray in the verbal forms or the cognitive forms that I was so conditioned in the evangelical church. And so when I was introduced to contemplative practices where prayer became being, the breathing, the stillness, the listening, the silence, that is also what actually healed me and kept me in the faith, I'll say. I can just imagine if I wasn't introduced to these practices and I was like pushing up against my more cognitive and verbal ways of prayer, it would have broken me even more than I was already. So when I introduce these practices to our community too, some resonate, but some do not, because as we know, when we're by ourselves, the flood of trauma comes back. The memories that we had purposefully forgotten all come back. And so there is a balance of knowing, again, like as we talked about spiritual indigenous practices, singing and dancing, huge, right?
Yeah.
It's very vocal,
Yeah.
not silent at
There you
all,
go.
and very fun, right?
Psalmic, yeah.
Yes, moment. So that is the practice to do that. What work best for them. And as we talked to you about embodied practices, music and dance is all embodied, right? And so there's balance. As I personally have been leaning more into contemplative science and how the brain heals itself through contemplation, I've been introducing these concepts to our community, and we're trying to learn how do we integrate it as multiple methodologies of healing with survivors, right? There are many forms of healing, and this is where we're using science, but we're also using indigenous practice. We're using survivor perception. We're using my, ideas. But for them, it's a matter of holding all of these different methodologies and discerning for them what looks like healing practice.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Dean Abraham and whatever.
Well, there are a number of excellent questions on here, and I don't know whether to take it in the order that we got them or what's most interesting for me, which is rather selfish. So I'll go with in the order that we got them. Okay. So I think one of the most important ones is there a way to include perpetrators in our circle of healing? By, also being careful not to re-trigger the victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a concept called restorative justice, which is more so in like prison systems.
Yes.
I have not personally ventured into that work of restorative justice. However, I have a few friends who have been perpetrators of violence who are also survivors themselves. And so I think just having those friendships helps me to expand my understanding of what healing could look like for them. Also knowing abusers abuse because they're abused as well. I don't believe any man wakes up or any woman wakes up and they just decided to hurt somebody. It came from other trauma. Yeah, so that just helps our understanding. But I don't do restorative justice work. I think I'd be curious to learn too, though, what are safe ways to have a restorative justice. I do think though sexual trauma has to have its boundaries. And I feel like churches, I've read so many cases of churches who are trying to reintegrate too soon, too fast, to have this, what is it called? Reconciliation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That term makes me cringe a little bit because it's been used in ways that have not been healthy without the justice side, right? So they both have to come together, reconciliation and the justice. But also I think reconciliation needs to be determined by the person who has been abused. If that means reintegration, let's figure out what that means, especially to have safer systems. And if that means the boundary, let the boundary be so without the church trying to put it together when it doesn't need to be put together. Lots of that.
No, I think, students were already on this track, and there was a clear question about restorative justice from Sarah, where, are there ways to think about punishment or, some form of, I don't know, redress from the perpetrators that are not punitive? So it heads into that territory of restorative justice or practices.
Yeah, and I'll say, prisons work, let me say that my father was a dentist in the prison in a Napa State Hospital, and it's just interesting. It's like all of his clients were rapists and murderers. And here I am supporting the other side. So this is where, even in my own family, we have systems of support and healthcare on both spectrums. And he even runs a Bible study in that hospital. And I'm like, you do you, Dad. Like I support him doing that. He supports me doing that. I think that's kind of, other people will have their lane. Our lane is in survivor care. I want to add though, in terms of, this beyond perpetrator and victim reconciliation, victim and family reconciliation and restoration. So like I said, a lot of families, a lot of churches have demonized the survivor many times. And so a lot of our work, or our social workers' work and our counselors' work is to also reunify with the family. So we also see that as a way of restorative justice.
Oh, that's great. I think there was a question that addressed some of this issue. Janice asked, how has the community, which could be family, other contexts, or maybe even the communities in Kenya and Zambia, how have they responded to your work and to the stories of these women?
Yeah, so when we're out in community, so right now we have 33 girls in our scholarship program. Through their leadership, we impact over 3,000 people per year. So when we're talking to 3,000 people about sexual abuse prevention, healing from trauma, storytelling with dignity, child abuse prevention, even like more empathetic, compassionate leadership, we are confronted with many survivors and many leaders too, who just don't know what to do in advocacy. So the response has been positive, which only shows that there's need for this type of work, especially in a way that is survivor-led, because the reason why our work is survivor-led is because we believe that those with lived experiences have the best solution because we've been through it. And so I think that's why the solutions that we're providing are so resonant for these communities, because I'm not the one up there telling you how to live your life, right? The survivors are telling us, this is how we can create a better world together.
So one of my favorite ideas that has come up in chat over here is, how do we re-dignify the human body? Because violence towards human bodies arises from a sense that some bodies do not have dignity, and that I am free then to trample on them. So how do we create a theological framework for bodies so that all bodies are considered sacred?
Yeah. I think that's what we're exploring, huh?
That's
Right?
right.
That's exactly what we're exploring in
Yeah.
the context of these next few weeks. How do we? I will say, kind of back to the indigenous spiritual practices of music and dance. I've just seen that become just such a way of reintegrating body, mind, and soul through the power of dance. There's just such power and beauty and sensuality and grace, right, that comes with bodily movement. And so how I've learned it and how I've observed it with others, especially survivors who can dance, it's this reclaiming of their power in their body when they dance. And it could be sensual for them. It could be graceful for them. It could be powerful. It could be strong. And that's all forms of expression that allows them to reclaim in that way. So that's how I've seen it, I think, more closely with dance in a way of, using the body as a form of reclamation.
I think also, I'm just going to move a little bit away from the questions because a lot of thoughts here. Love to capture your ideas. Thank you for the conversation. Thinking about how historically we've looked at sexuality, which on the one hand is critical for human psychological health, but on the other hand, so many of our human institutions create a culture of shame, secrecy, negativity, or just, disgust around sexuality. So again, I think part of the theology of the body that makes the body sacred again is going to have to do the work of re-sacralizing sexuality, which
Absolutely.
makes, I would say, Christian theologians nervous.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm saying we in the 2,000-year-old sense, not Professor McMahon and I personally, but we did so much work as Christian theologians to try and overturn the fertility theology that existed prior to Christianity, which is its own form of colonization.
Absolutely. Yeah. Purity culture. I mean, I was right in purity culture for sure, like that's my age, that grew up there. And it's definitely infiltrated in Kenya and Zambia too. So I feel like what we're doing as an organization, and as we're kind of growing and healing and moving together, we're unlearning abusive patterns. We're unlearning the ways the church has taught us to hate our bodies and our sexuality and ourselves. And then we're relearning in context of our faith, in context of the trauma we've experienced. What does that ethic look like moving forward? And it looks different for everyone. Absolutely. And some who, because of the trauma, refuse to engage in any sexual relationships because they're still healing, right? And we respect that. There are others who believe that having sexual experiences will help them reclaim, right? in a consensual way, right? So, right, so the diversity of thought that I've heard from our community is just really helps, again, me also expand
Right.
my view of sexuality and the body and how God is entwined in all of it.
Right. And that's something, you know, those of us who are here, we do so well here at PSR. When we say we are queer, what that means is not just an identity, it's that we resolutely reclaim sexuality as a site of liberation. It is not a site of wounding and trauma, even though in our history it has been, but we are reclaiming it as a site of growth and life. One question that's in the back of my mind, because you invoked Henri Nouwen, and that was very close to me in many, many ways. Henri Nouwen talks about the wounded healer, one of his other books. How do we, as pastors, as leaders, stop from having our own trauma triggered by listening to other people's pain? Because your fourth point was about presence. So can we be present if all we are doing is thinking about our own pain? Is my question.
Yeah, love that book. It's also required reading for all my staff. Yeah, and that's where I think, you know, individual healing and collective healing has to happen in tandem. If we're only seeking collective healing, we negate a lot of the things that are hidden, that are that may not resonate actually with other people. So we're looking to other people for healing, and I don't think that is holistic healing. So it has to happen in tandem. And we have to ensure that we have our own systems of support. I'll talk about this more next week as we talk about the transformation piece, now that we've engaged in such deep suffering and have experienced burnout like I have many, many times, and that burnout that led to my hospitalization. How do we transform so that that doesn't happen again? So that I don't get go in the hospital again, dear Lord, I hope not. But I think that's where we need to have our own communal practices of that reciprocal healing, practicing that reciprocal healing, having our own private practices that lends to that more internal healing with the divine. And we also have private practice in context with counselor or spiritual director or somebody that can hear us subjectively and also professionally. I think that well-rounded support systems can help us be healers as we are healed all simultaneously.
Thank you. And I think that's what this community is doing for each other. As if you read the chat, you will see this community is being supportive of each other as people are talking about their own particular trauma. We are at time.
We are indeed. Just want to thank you again, Ms. Nikole Lynn. Would you please join me in thanking Ms. Lynn? We look forward to your talk next week. And thank you all for joining us. Please remember we are here again next Thursday at the same time. And we can be found on the website. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you all. Thank you to my class. I'll see you on Saturday. Be well.
And I will see my class on Saturday.
All right. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Oh, thank you.